This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, I will be speaking with integral philosopher Steve McIntosh about purpose. Is there purpose in the universe? What is purpose? How do people seek out purpose? And things of that nature. We'll do that in a moment. This is another in my series on purpose. This time I'm speaking with integral philosopher Steve McIntosh. As I usually do, I want to give people a few minutes to just tell a little bit about themselves. So Steve, if you could just give a little bit of biographical background, maybe a little bit on some of the works that you've written, and also your ideas about the nature of purpose.
Sure. Thanks for your attention to my work, Dan. Pleasure to be with you today. I have been working in the field of integral philosophy since about the year 2000. Integral philosophy, or the integral movement, is kind of an intellectual community that has sprung up in the United States and really around the world. Just about every continent has integral practitioners. It's a philosophical perspective that recognizes the evolution of consciousness and culture. In other words, it's a fresh way of looking at how society and culture evolves and emerges, and how, by understanding the development of culture and consciousness more thoroughly and with greater detail, we can actually facilitate that evolution. In other words, the reason that integral philosophy is interesting to me is that when we look at the world's problems, obviously we live in a world of trouble and suffering, but in some ways, almost every human problem is at least partially a problem of consciousness. So if we can understand how people value the world, how they perceive the world, how they perceive their best interests, how they perceive the good life, if we understand that better and see how it develops over time, the promises that will be more effective at gently persuading people to expand or evolve their own consciousness by increasing the scope of what they're able to value. So integral philosophy is not just furniture for the mind or some interesting speculations about the cosmos. It's got real political implications in terms of how we can make the world a better place. So I was drawn to integral philosophy. Much of it emerges out of progressive spirituality, what used to be called, the New Age. But I think practitioners of integral are very conscientious not to be New Age, not to think in magical terms or to accept spiritual belief systems as simply given. We're trying to bring back philosophical rigor and critical thinking, and even a kind of a scientific view, without regressing to a scientific materialist worldview. So I grew up in Los Angeles. I wasn't raised in any kind of spiritual tradition. But at an early age, around 13, I started becoming interested in the counterculture, and specifically in the new kind of spirituality that was emerging out of the counterculture of the early 70s, which I'm calling progressive spirituality. And this was something that I really identified with and felt called to participate in terms of reading everything I could and learning all about it and being part of that culture. Then by the late 70s, I realized that even though I wanted to be a participant in progressive spirituality and add to it, I also realized I needed establishment credentials. And I wanted to be able to play in the mainstream world as well as in the counterculture. So that led me to go to business school, where I studied entrepreneurship at USC in LA, where I lived. Then I did well there, and I decided I'd go to law school. Not that I ever wanted to be a professional lawyer, but it was a great graduate degree that would be both intellectually interesting and, vocationally viable. So I went to law school at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville for 3 years in the 80s, and I really developed my mind and my intellect in ways that I'm grateful for. I moved to San Francisco after law school to take a job temporarily, to kind of pay off my student debts at a big law firm. But I realized I wasn't cut out to be a lawyer. Never thought I would. And so then I went into business. I moved to Boulder, Colorado to help start an environmentally friendly household cleaning product company. That company was acquired. I worked for the acquirer for a while, Celestial Seasonings. But by '94, I kind of had a spiritual awakening. I'd always been part of this progressive spiritual movement, but '94 I realized that I had been investing in my future, and that the future was, now it was dawning. So I left my job as a corporate executive, and I tried to, at the time in the '90s, especially here in Boulder and other progressive, locations around America, it really seemed like there was a spiritual renaissance, a kind of fluorescence of progressive spiritual culture. And I wanted to follow the original calling that I felt in the '70s to participate in progressive spirituality. And I'd been a keen student of what causes culture to move. I'd studied periods of fluorescence or emergence in human history, whether it be the Renaissance, or the Enlightenment, or even the '60s. We could identify many different periods of culture in many different kinds of culture where new forms have emerged, kind of more inclusive forms of truth and beauty and goodness. So this was something I was very interested in because I wanted to help participate in an emergence which felt like it was happening in the '90s. And when I was drawn to the idea that what marks these periods of cultural fluorescence is new kinds of art, new art in the Renaissance, or classical music in the Enlightenment. And I thought that since it felt like a spiritual renaissance in the '90s among the counterculture, that I would try to intuit and express the tenets of what I was framing at the time as the spiritual Renaissance art movement, which led me to create a company, Now and Zen, where we created artifacts of the spiritual Renaissance. And while the art movement that I had hoped would appear along with the fluorescence of progressive spirituality in the '90s never really materialized, the company, Now and Zen, did well. This product I invented, the Zen alarm clock, which is kind of an art clock with an acoustic chime that wakes you gradually. That sold hundreds of thousands of units. But I realized that this calling that I felt to participate in a cultural emergence was something beyond progressive spirituality. And that really led me to the integral philosophy movement, which came together in the late '90s and really achieved its own kind of initial fluorescence in the 2000s. Ken Wilber, spiral dynamics. There were a lot of active ingredients of integral philosophy that were being widely adopted and regularly popular, at least within certain segments, in the 2000s. And I was part of the integral movement then. But I realized that beyond Ken Wilber and beyond spiral dynamics, I had a contribution to make to the integral canon. At least I was worth a try. And so around 2004, I started working on my first book, which came out in 2007, Integral Consciousness and the Future of Evolution. And that book was both a kind of a general, accessible introduction to the integral perspective, as well as the second half provided a constructive critique of Ken Wilber and tried to add some of my own philosophical thinking to the field. That led to my second book, which I think we're going to be focusing on in this interview, and that is Evolution's Purpose. The subtitle of my 2012 book, Evolution's Purpose, is an integral interpretation of the scientific story of our origins. And I was proud of that work. It was really well received, like Integral Consciousness, which led to my third book, the one that just came out recently, The Presence of the Infinite, the Spiritual Experience of Beauty, Truth, and Goodness. And that book's doing well. And so I'm working on that, the books, the writing, the spiritual side of my work. And also there's a political side of my work too. This integral philosophy is more than a spiritual philosophy. It's like I said, a philosophy which can solve problems and address real world issues. And so in 2012, I co-founded an integral political think tank, which focuses on the cultural roots of America's problems, which is known as the Institute for Cultural Evolution. And our main focus is on political polarization, right? Because that's something we need to grow out of. I mean, cultural evolution is really the only permanent solution to our hyper-partisan, polarized democracy. So, that's another part of my work, but that's probably enough background on my journey.
Just one thing, you said that your first book was Integral Consciousness and the Future of Evolution, but I'm seeing you wrote a book called The Golden Mean Book in '97, was that?
Oh, sure, yeah. That was part of Now and Zen. In other words, all the products of Now and Zen, the main product was the Zen alarm clock, as I said. We had many different versions of that. But in the '90s, in terms of trying to start or participate in an art movement, everything that Now and Zen produced was both a product and a book. And so the Zen Alarm Clock came with a book that wasn't just an instruction manual. It also had a chapter on meditation and affirmations and, New Age stuff like that. And it also, another product that I created that was quite popular was the Golden Mean book and caliper set. This was a booklet, 64 pages on sacred geometry. And it came with sort of these plastic calipers that were, a tool and a gimmick at the same time. But my interest in sacred geometry with the golden ratio or the golden mean as sort of the most sort of concentrated essence of evident sacredness within mathematics. The reason I was interested in sacred geometry was that it was a kind of an obvious intersection of science and spirituality, or at least mathematics and spirituality. I mean, there's some of the elements of sacred geometry, like the golden ratio or the Platonic solids, are unmistakably, magical in their own way. They are mysterious and beautiful and evoke a sense of the sacred, and are indeed formulas for beauty, which is its own, opening for understanding the philosophical dimensions. So that was sacred geometry was one of the principles of this Now and Zen company. That all the designs were made with sacred geometry in mind, and the Golden Mean book was one of the Now and Zen products. But sacred geometry, after I was attracted to it in the mid-'90s, by the late '90s, it had become sort of colonized by very magical New Age impresarios, and I sort of was somewhat repulsed by the magical thinking that became associated with sacred geometry. And it was around that time that I discovered integral philosophy, and my intellectual interests were drawn away. So that's the quick background on the Golden Mean book.
Now, before I just started with Evolution's Purpose, that book, just for those who don't know, can you just give a little background about Ken Wilber and integral philosophy?
Sure. Ken Wilber is an American philosopher. He comes out of the progressive spiritual movement, being a Buddhist, but as he has, in a sense, worked on many books, beginning in the 70s, in the 90s, his work kind of culminated in a real masterpiece of the book, Sex, Ecology, Spirituality, that was published in 1995, where Wilber brought together the existing trends of evolutionary philosophy, as found in the work of Alfred North Whitehead and Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, John Getzer, other previous philosophers who had been drawn to the implications of a universe of becoming. In other words, they realized that science's discovery of evolution had deep philosophical and even spiritual implications, and there was a sort of line of thinkers who try to reckon with evolution philosophically and spiritually. And so Wilber was adding to that, but because he was writing in the late 90s or mid-90s, in this book, Sex, Ecology, Spirituality, he was able to bring in many developments that hadn't really been on the radar screen of these previous philosophers, and that included developmental psychology and systems science and postmodern critiques of modernity. Wilber created what I call the 21st century integral synthesis, which brought forward a lot of strands and tied them together to bring about a more robust version of integral philosophy. As I describe the intellectual history of it and its various founders in integral consciousness. But the thing which really made integral philosophy pop and created a worldwide intellectual community that was much larger than Ken Wilber's work was the addition of the insights of Claire Graves, who was a developmental psychologist who really kind of discovered in his research this stage of consciousness and culture, which is, for lack of a better word, postmodern. Right? The word postmodern has all kinds of different meanings. Indeed, it's a battleground of meaning. But in integral parlance, we're talking about a worldview that has emerged beyond modernism, beyond the modernity, and it still is somewhat countercultural. It has many different strands. There's certainly postmodern philosophy, but there's also the American counterculture in which this New Age or progressive spirituality has really found a home. There's also the politics of Occupy Wall Street, and defining this postmodern worldview would be kind of an interview unto itself. But one of the terms that's used to describe it beyond postmodernism is also the progressive counterculture, the cultural creatives, the green meme. This the recognition that this cultural frame was actually a worldview that could be compared, as a historically significant development that was similar to modernity and similar to the traditional worldview that preceded modernity. But postmodernism was, like the other stages, kind of dialectically separated. There was a thesis and antithesis kind of relationship between mainstream modernity and this postmodern worldview. So it was around 1999 that we collectively began to get a clearer view of postmodernism as a cultural development in history. We realized that we were all in some ways participating in this development, but it had never been framed from the outside as well as it had been by the work of Clare Graves as popularized by spiral dynamics. So when Wilbur adopted spiral dynamics into his work in 1999, it was around the same time that I had discovered the book, it really felt as though something had gelled. The fifth discipline, the one thing that was missing kind of came together, and we could see things more clearly than ever before in terms of the development of consciousness and culture, as I've said. So that was 2000. That was when I was drawn into the integral movement, and since then I've dedicated my life to participating in its emergence.
Now, you mentioned the book Evolution's Purpose, and that for a lot of people in sciences seems to be oxymoronic, because if we go with natural selection's idea via Darwin and Wallace and people like that, is that things happen, random mutations occur, things happen, and there's no purpose. Does that mean that by writing that book, are you positing, say, that there is a purpose or that there is an artificer?
In the book, I argue carefully for evidence for purpose in evolution. And then that's not an argument, as it's subtly explained and carefully argued in the book. It's not an argument for intelligent design. Yeah. I'm not positing that the universe is deterministically pre-planned. As Henri Bergson said, nature is more and better than a plan in the course of realization. So when I talk about evolution's purpose, I'm not necessarily implying a creator God who intervenes in the course of the universe's development. But I am saying that there's purpose in the universe, right? We all get up in the morning with a purpose. Indeed, human life would not function if we weren't purposeful creatures. Indeed, life itself depends on purpose for its evolution. In other words, Darwin's theory of natural selection rests upon the intentionality of life, but it doesn't explain that intentionality. And when I mean intentionality, I mean that even the most primitive life form, an amoeba, will exhibit a striving to survive and reproduce. Right? If there's an amoeba in a petri dish, and you pour sugar in one end and some toxic substance in the other end, the amoeba will swim toward the glucose or whatever. And of course, that's genetically pre-programmed, instinctual, semi-automatic. But there is something about life's striving to survive and reproduce, which makes it unique. In other words, many of the scientists, Lynn Margulis probably most notably, has tried to define life. What is life? And so she asked a bunch of scientists, and the best definition she got said, well, that could apply to a thermometer. It's responsive. And she said, we want to get down to the essence of it. What is life, and what distinguishes it from matter? And she said that life is matter that chooses. And as life evolves, this instinctual, genetically pre-programmed intentionality to survive and reproduce gradually develops through stages of emergence, whereby animal consciousness becomes more and more purposeful. We could maybe call it quasi-purpose in animals. But by the time we get to the higher mammals, where there's self-awareness, and not just surviving and reproducing, but there's group selection, there's family dynamics, and the intentionality of life forms, pre-human life forms, is a very important part of understanding evolution. So, for example, if life forms weren't striving to survive and reproduce and fill up every niche, at the basic level, there wouldn't be any competition between life forms, which is necessary for natural selection to act. So, life is a river that runs uphill. It defies matter. It has goals. Matter, material things, material forms of organization don't strive, and they don't have goals that they can fail to achieve, right? So if we're talking about evolution's purpose, the first thing to recognize is that their life exhibits purpose or quasi-purpose, and that's what distinguishes it from matter. And just as this kind of purpose emerges in life, with the emergence of humans, a higher kind of purpose appears. Likewise, just like it's hard to sometimes distinguish matter from life, but somehow life can't be entirely reduced to matter. At least I argue, and other insightful scientists argue. In the same way, there's an emergence with humanity that, although it rests upon life, can't be entirely reduced to life. In other words, the evolution of human consciousness and culture can't be reduced without remainder to biological evolution. There's a new domain of evolution. And what makes this new domain of evolution real is this higher form of purpose, which humans have, a kind of a free will purpose. Again, I argue for free will in my books. Not entirely unrestricted, unfettered free will. Of course, we're determined by our evolutionary psychology. We're determined by our culture. We're determined by the political constraints of our generation. But in between these deterministic influences of culture and biology, there's a small degree of freedom. And I argue, indeed, Abraham Maslow recognized that as people evolve, as they become self-actualized, they become more free. Their will becomes less determined. So humans emerge, and this new kind of freedom to imagine how things could be better, to have a purpose to make things better in a way that goes beyond merely biological thriving, beyond surviving and reproducing. Humans can imagine how things can be better. And for the last 40,000 years, 60,000 years, for the last many, thousands of generations of humans have been trying to improve their conditions, and that's kind of the key piece of evidence that distinguishes us from our animal cousins. And that is, we have the ability to evolve our culture, both materially and culturally, organizationally, but in terms of values. And human values, in other words, what can be improved in the human condition is largely determined by the horizon of what improvement means, right? So at early stages of human development, improvement meant protection from the saber-toothed tigers. Improvement meant a better way to create a fire. Improvement meant more effective weapons. And so that was sort of the purview of the worldview which formed the sort of the archaic human cultural condition. But eventually, as those problems at that level were solved, a new horizon of improvement emerged, a new definition of what improvement itself was. In other words, although humans have been trying to improve their conditions for thousands of years, the most dramatic forms of improvement have come when humans have improved their definition of improvement itself. So what that means is that a new worldview emerges, right? So from archaic survival bands, a new worldview emerges that creates a tribe with a chief and a shaman and an animistic perception of the enchanted, nature of the universe. And this is a kind of a larger worldview. But eventually, the problems or types of improvement that worldview frames, as those improvements are achieved, and this evolutionary impulse to make things better grows restless, another layer of emergence occurs with a new worldview, right? And so we see this pattern in history of relative homeostasis in culture, and then there's a break. There's an emergence of something more that comes from something less. Even though there's things that are lost along the way, there's a definite way in which, as culture emerges, that which is understood to be valuable expands. And so this is one sort of convenient way of talking about the evolution of consciousness, is by expanding the scope of what we're able to value. By, for example, by moving from the conception of those worthy of moral consideration, right? At first it's just your blood kin. And then as culture evolves, then it becomes your religious compatriots, people in the same belief system as you. Then it emerges that those are in the same nation, even though they have different religions, are worthy of kind of patriotic consideration. And as this postmodern worldview emerges, we move from a kind of a nation-centric morality to a more world-centric morality. So we can see a progression from ethnocentric to nation-centric to world-centric, and few would argue that this expanding scope of those that are worthy of moral consideration is not authentic evolution in human culture.
Now, so your argument would be then that purpose is somehow epiphenomenal to existence, that it emerges perhaps out of the four known physical forces, a weak and strong nuclear force, gravity, electromagnetism, somehow that these forces in their interplay, for example, have produced some kind of purpose via evolution?
I wouldn't use the word epiphenomenal, right? Because that sort of indicates that there's no feedback. In other words, that regardless of whether we allow any neo-Lamarckian considerations to, or epigenetics to influence our understanding of biological evolution, when it comes to the evolution of human culture, clearly purpose is indicated, right? In other words, the evolution of human history and culture, that doesn't happen by natural selection. It happens by actual selection. In other words, people are trying to make things better. They have a purpose to make things better. So the evolution of human history depends upon that purpose. It doesn't emerge epiphenomenally, out of that activity. So in the book Evolution's Purpose, when I get down to arguing for the evidence for purpose in evolution, one of the pieces of evidence that I point to is what I call the rising flow of creativity. This is a phrase that was actually coined by Kelly. Forget his first name, but the idea is that since the beginning, since the debris of the Big Bang, the hydrogen and helium atoms that were the only form of universe organization shortly after the Big Bang, there's been this trend in evolution where something more keeps coming from something less. There's a structure of emergence whereby the original emergence of hydrogen, complexifies and is built upon by later appearing forms of emergence. Right at the macro scale, we have the debris of the Big Bang organizing into the first generation of stars, which help create the heavy elements in the second generation of stars, which creates planets. Right? At the micro level, we have the periodic table of elements, right, where we see a clear progression in the atomic weight of the elements as this structure of emergence and cosmological evolution unfolds. Right? There's greater forms of organization, more accomplished behaviors among these, these forms of cosmological evolution. And then, of course, there's a transcendence of cosmological evolution itself with the emergence of life, kind of a second Big Bang, right? Life, likewise, the structure of emergence continues as life complexifies, building on what came before, right? Cells are transcended but included within the larger forms of organization. So life is kind of building on itself, and this same structure of emergence is contained within our own bodies, right? So the most numerous atoms in our bodies are hydrogen atoms, right? The main ingredient of our body is water, right? The main ingredient of water is hydrogen. And so the hydrogen is only created one time in the history of the universe, and that is at the Big Bang. All the hydrogen, was created then and none since. So the hydrogen atoms that are in some sense the foundation of our bodies are the way in which the first primordial emergence of the Big Bang is online and functioning within us. And practically all the other steps that have led to the emergence of planet Earth, that have led to the emergence of the human species, are online and functioning. Another way of looking at it, sometimes, scientism says that, we realize we're just a planet on the outskirts of the Milky Way, and we're completely insignificant and tiny, and it's pure conceit for man to think that he's special, right? But for another argument, we are in some ways the center in terms of complexity. Right, so if you look at the largest forms of universe organization, galaxies, those are large, but they're not very complex. Right, it's very, very simple. Likewise, at the other end of the spectrum, quarks or subatomic particles, very tiny, but also very simple. But in between these two ends of universe scale, right in the middle from the smallest quark to the largest galaxy, there's the most complex forms of organization, which according to science, is the human brain and indeed the human body that goes with it. So in some ways, we are the center of the universe in terms of the understanding of the complexity of our organization. And we're also central in the way that we embody the structure of emergence. Because the structure of emergence, as I'm talking about, through the Big Bang, through the periodic table, through the tree of life, it extends into human history, into human culture, in the way that I explained how we've had these stages of cultural development: tribal, warrior, traditional, modernist, postmodern. Now, the postmodern, this integral perspective, is a new worldview that includes the postmodern, but also breaks with it, which transcends it by trying to better include the previous stages, better including modernity and its values, better including the traditional values that are rejected by many postmodernists. So the structure of emergence I'm talking about is not only in our bodies. We not only embody it in our bodies, we also embody it in our minds. The consciousness we're using to have this conversation is dependent upon the structure of human cultural emergence over the last 50,000 years or so. And so because we are embodying this purpose, because our purpose is widening as our consciousness evolves, because our will is becoming more free as we achieve greater stages of actualization, we can read off of this a very special significance for our purpose. In other words, we're sort of little microcosmic expressions of the universe as a whole. At least that's one view that I think is philosophically supportable. And because purpose is central to who we are as creatures, I don't think it's a complete stretch to say that just as we embody purpose and we embody the universe, that's evidence for the universe itself embodying a kind of purpose which, again, is not deterministic, it's not interventionist, but it's not completely deistic either. It's not as if whatever creative force or first cause created the Big Bang, just began and that's it. I think there is ongoing purpose, and I think it's expressed in us. And if we want to know evolution's purpose, all we have to do is look within ourselves. Our purposes are its purposes.
Well, let's end this first segment here. And in the next segment, I want to dig a little bit further into the book and your ideas about evolution's purpose, and we'll do that in a moment. I've been speaking with Steve McIntosh on purpose. I'm going to dig a little bit deeper into his book about evolution's purpose. Now, you said that you didn't think that purpose was epiphenomenal in the cosmos, but do you subscribe to a more teleological idea about purpose in evolution or out?
Yes, but I'm careful to define what I mean by teleology, right? In other words, I describe in evolution's purpose the idea of an autopoietic teleology, and what I mean by that is that as evolution unfolds through this structure of emergence that we've been talking about, there's an emergence of intentionality in life, which grows and quickens as life evolves, and then there's an emergence of a kind of a second order intentionality in humans, which allows us to evolve our culture, which then in turn allows us to evolve our consciousness in ways that animal consciousness can't evolve, right? Animals, in order to get smarter, they have to evolve their biology. But humans have demonstrated the ability to expand their consciousness without having corresponding changes in our biology, right? Like we may have wired up new parts of our brain, but our basic cognitive anatomy has not changed significantly, since the early modern humans. But our consciousness, of course, has changed dramatically. So in terms of teleology, evolution is in our hands, right? At this third stage of evolution, the evolution of human history, we're trying to make things better, and what's better is up to us, right? And indeed, we're making things better, and eventually we find better definitions of better, or improved ways to understand what it means to improve things. And the way I talk about this in the book is through the framework of the beautiful, the true, and the good. Right? These have been recognized since antiquity as, in a sense, the primary values, the most intrinsic values, and that there's a whole philosophy that goes with understanding the meaning of the beautiful, the true, and the good, not as pre-given Platonic forms, but not as purely subjective preferences either. Right? These values, these directions of evolution, these ways that we can make things better, are in a sense, they require our assent. Values have both an objective pole in terms of the objective quality of the universe, and a subjective pole because they're not valuable unless there's somebody there to value them, right? So they're not purely objective or purely subjective. They bring subject and object together. So we're striving for the good, the true, and the beautiful, each in our own way. Each culture has its own definition. But there's remarkable similarities across cultures among certain expressions of what's beautiful, true, and good. And because we're working to discover and to express these values in our lives, that's kind of one way of understanding human spirituality, is the quest for the good, the true, and the beautiful. The teleology of evolution is sort of engaged at that frontier. In other words, the teleology of evolution, as I argue carefully in the book, it's somewhat difficult to unpack in a short interview like this. But I argue that the evolution is moving toward the beautiful, the true, and the good. I mean, sometimes with setbacks and regressions and with all kinds of problems and horrors along the way. It's not an upward escalator to the good, nor is it a linear progression.
It's cyclical.
Well, I wouldn't say that either. In other words, the nice thing about the spiral image is it's both cyclical and progressive. In other words, the spiral is getting wider. A logarithmic helix, right, is growing, even though it's returning. Like Mark Twain said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme.
Yeah.
And so, there's ways in which we can see cycles, but there's also a way in which history is not just, a repeating cycle over and over again. Things are changing and becoming, I would argue, improved in many ways. Even though, again, we've lost things along the way, even though we've made things better in astounding ways, those very improvements have brought new problems, which require further improvement, right? So modernity brings, scientific medicine and worldwide connectivity. But it also brings environmental degradation and, gross forms of inequality, nuclear proliferation, right? But the answer to those problems is not to regress to a pre-modern medieval world where those problems are no longer evident. The idea is to go further and to find more inclusive and powerful worldviews that can solve the problems of environmental degradation, nuclear proliferation, economic inequality. So, coming back to this idea of purpose being epiphenomenal and teleology not being epiphenomenal, I understand the word epiphenomenon as I've seen it described in the scientific literature as like the froth on the wave. The wave's breaking on the shore and there's a bunch of foam on the top of the wave, but it just kind of emerges with the motion of the wave and it's just kind of part of it, but not the essence of what it's about. And I would say that our purpose is not epiphenomenal because it's directly involved with the process of cultural evolution, right? We're trying to make things better. That's our purpose. We have a sense or a duty. We have an evolutionary impulse that things can be better, right? We recognize we live in a world of trouble and suffering, and many of us feel a duty to try to ameliorate, that trouble and suffering. So there's a way in which our purposes are not the froth on the wave, but our purposes are in some ways driving, the motion of the wave itself. And there's what's known in philosophical parlance as downward causation. Where there was in the structure of emergence, if one level can actually influence the level that preceded it, then there's not only the upward causation of us, relying on our material bodies, but there's also ways in which our human purposes are directly influencing, just as our consciousness can influence our body, our collective cultural purposes can profoundly influence the direction of humanity's evolution, and indeed maleficent purposes can cause us to be set back. That's another evidence for a relative degree of freedom in human choosing. So I would say that the teleology, the direction of evolution, life is pointing in that direction as it strives to survive and reproduce. Striving and reproducing is a primitive form of goodness. It's a value, right? Life values itself, and it values its species. It values itself when it, avoids trying to get killed. It values its species when it seeks to reproduce. And these are real strivings. They're evaluations, right? Even primitive life forms have this. And we as humans, we value all kinds of things, and as we value those things, we hope bring them into being, or we give preference to them, and that, in a sense, is what's driving evolution. So the goals of evolution are the goals of humanity in improving our condition and moving toward an increasingly utopian state. And as I argue in the book, I think that these purposes that we have in making things better have cosmic implications which feed back on our understanding of the larger purpose of the universe.
Now, when you talked about the spiral, I've often said to younger people, because in the arts, one of the frustrating things about the arts, for example, is that so much pop cultural crap is at the fore and it sells the most, and it gets bad films get produced, whereas a great filmmaker or a great writer or a great artist may not get into the right gallery or get published in their lifetime or get money for their film. I've always talked about what I call the ever-widening cone of greatness, i.e. that if you look at something like Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman, his poems, many, many, many times more people since his death have read his works than did when they were alive. And then the great stuff perdures because it offers something going forward, which is sort of like, I think, evolution, in that when you have favorable traits, those get passed on. So that just came to mind when you're talking about the spiral. I wanted to talk, though, do you reckon, for example, with artificial intelligence, in your view, that, for example, evolution biologically will somehow merge with and or be superseded perhaps by artificial intelligence? Because, we have this idea now of the last couple of decades with people like Ray Kurzweil talking about the singularity, the merging of organic and non-organic forms.
Sure, yeah, I can address that.
Yeah.
I don't deal with it that much in the book, but I've spoken about it elsewhere. I think this idea that humanity, in the extreme versions of the singularity, where machines become intelligent in a way that they're self-aware and they take over their own replication and development, right? In other words, in some of these more extreme scenarios, we're close to a tipping point where the evolution of human consciousness and culture will be in some way superseded by the emergence of a new domain of evolution in which artificial consciousness and technology kind of starts to evolve itself in a way that is a sort of runaway, and that we're no longer in control of it, and we become transcended by that level of evolution. And I think that's actually a ridiculously naive assumption of scientism that is grossly misunderstands the nature of consciousness, and I think that it's a sort of science fiction fantasy. And the reason that I say that is that this idea, if your paradigm is that consciousness is a physical thing, in other words, our brains are producing our thoughts, and it's just a matter of time until neuroscience discovers how the brain gives us this sense of subjective interiority, or our qualia, or our awareness, right? So if you're operating out of a philosophical frame that views the world as entirely material and consciousness is somehow material, then it's not that much of a leap to then think, well, all we have to do is get the hardware in the computer complex enough so that it is similar to the human brain, there's enough connections, and that the physicality, the physical complexity of that artificial hardware will generate something equivalent to human consciousness. But I think that human consciousness is irreducible to our brains. I don't think the mind and the brain are identical. Evan Thompson, the philosopher, had a great analogy of this. It's like thinking that the mind is in the brain is similar to thinking that the flight of a bird is in the wings, right? The bird needs wings and we need a brain, but the flight of the bird is at a whole other level. And our consciousness is at an emergent level, I argue, and many other distinguished thinkers argue, that consciousness can be reduced, and that it is in some ways an emergent property which has non-physical characteristics which science can't explain. I mean, indeed, in scientism, they refer to the hard problem. Right? David Chalmers coined the term. The hard problem of consciousness is how we get from a physical brain to this internal, sense of awareness and the unity of our consciousness, qualia, and all these other subjective elements which are a big part of our lives. And I would argue that that this consciousness is, in some ways, depends upon the rest of the structure of emergence. From a Whiteheadian philosophical view, which is known as pan-experientialism, meaning that every form of organization in the universe has an interior in some primitive sense, moving all the way up, that the interiority that we enjoy as humans is dependent upon the functioning of the entire structure of emergence. And so the idea that we're going to just create a machine and it's going to replicate, in similar ways, this consciousness that it's taken 13 billion years for us to achieve, that's another argument against this idea of artificial intelligence becoming self-aware. Another argument is that if we think about these, as I mentioned, the three big bangs, right? The first big bang, 13.8 billion years ago. The second big bang with the emergence of life here and likely elsewhere throughout the universe. The third big bang with the emergence of this discrete domain of evolution in which human history evolves. If we look at those three things, and we look back at the previous emergence, the emergence of life from matter, in the 1950s, when they discovered that amino acids were, in a sense, self-organizing, when they created conditions that were thought to be similar to the early Earth, the soup, lightning strikes, that kind of thing, and then amino acids were appearing, they thought, wow, all we have to do is more accurately reproduce the conditions of the early Earth, and we'll get an emergence of DNA, right? That life will be replicated, and this second Big Bang will be created in a lab. But even after, since the 1950s, after billions and billions of dollars of investment in this project of recreating life in a test tube, they've never been able to do it. And again, some promise that it's just a matter of time, but they've been promising in the same way that it's just a matter of time until we can reduce consciousness to the brain. And I think this is what's known as promissory materialism. That we're going to be able to reduce the universe to matter in motion, just give us enough time. And I think that is folly. I think that because, in the same way that they've never been able to reproduce the emergence of life in any kind of satisfactory way from matter, the idea that we're going to reproduce the emergence of consciousness, is likewise folly. And so, I could go on, critiquing or arguing against, scientism in general and Kurzweil's view of the coming singularity in particular, but that's probably enough for now.
Well, one of the things that I've sometimes argued for when I've done these interviews with people is that a lot of people believe that mathematics is not just a language that we use to describe the universe, but actually, is a fundament of the universe. I believe that it's the way we describe things, and just as we may not have the language for a particular word, or a particular thing, rather, a word for a particular thing, we may not have the mathematics currently. When you say irreducible human complexity, or irreducible human mind, or the brain, would you allow that there could possibly be some alien intelligence that could understand this, just as there could be some alien mathematics that explains things elegantly that we're just missing, perhaps?
Well, certainly there's much to explain, in the universe, and civilizations on other planets whose consciousness has evolved, far beyond ours, because they may be likely, millions of years older than our culture. I think that the discoveries of the universe, the fact that the universe is intelligible to begin with, the fact that it can be understood, that we can actually reach back and understand our origins, we can understand evolution, we can understand the mathematical elegance of the laws of physics. That in itself is a revelation of the beautiful, the true, and the good. And I think that clearly we'll be able to understand more, and that mathematics will be our growing appreciation of mathematics and how that describes the universe, how it may even describe consciousness, is part of the bright promise of our further evolution. But I don't think that evolution, I don't think, from what we can tell, what we know now, scientifically, philosophically, and spiritually, is that the idea that as we advance, we're going to be able to describe consciousness in material terms, or that mathematics will eliminate, the mysteries of the universe. I think that's what Whitehead called the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. In other words, the idea that the most concrete things, the stuff that we can really hold on to, is matter, right? Or matter energy, or the stuff that's physical. It's a fallacy, because what's most concrete is not the matter and energy, right? When you look at the matter and energy in fine detail, you see that it's just relationships, mostly vibration. As White had explained, the ultimate matter of fact is not quarks or strings or subatomic particles. The ultimate matter of fact in the universe is creativity. Like, creativity is how he conceived of what it is that's emerging in this finite universe of evolution. And that brings us back to the idea of the universe creating value. Right? Something more keeps coming from something less. And that's another piece of evidence for evolution's purpose, is the way that it has been creating. There's value wherever there's positive creativity. And for the last 13.8 billion years, the universe has been producing positive creativity, which is evidenced by this structure of emergence that I've talked about.
Well, the title of your book would lend one to believe that there must be some kind of end game for evolution. And a lot of people, when they talk about possible, say, alternate universes, there's the idea that we are a computer program being programmed, but you get sort of that the turtles on top of turtles going down. There's always something before that. There's always, you get to what you call irreducibility, as you had mentioned, first cause. And I remember the old 1960s television show with Patrick McGowan called The Prisoner, which I think is one of the great TV shows of all time. There was one episode where they have this room-sized computer that supposedly is solving all these problems, and McGowan's character, number 6, types in 3 letters, WHY, and the computer fritzes out, why anything. Do you accept that there could be what we would call maybe just because answers, that there may not be purpose, but there may be some things that we just simply can't answer, that why is this? Just because. That's just the way it is. Do you accept that, or do you or not?
No, I don't. I think that's the answer that materialists often give. Don't ask what came before the Big Bang, because it's a nonsensical question. It's like asking what's north of the North Pole. That doesn't make any sense. And of course, that's true in the sense that the time, even Stephen Hawking has developed with Roger Penrose equations that show that time itself begins with the Big Bang. So the idea that asking what's before time is a illogical question, because that the whole inquiry is bound by a sense of linear time. So obviously our human brains, our finite consciousness, has limitations when we're talking about the infinite implications of the why of the universe. But and in evolution's purpose, I try to limit myself to talking about the evidence for purpose in evolution as far as philosophy can go. And then I end that chapter, on the philosophical arguments for purpose. And I allow myself a chapter of more theological arguments or theological speculation, right, which goes beyond philosophy. It goes beyond any kind of scientific evidence. But I think that it's plausible and indeed probable that there is a reason or a purpose for the emergence of this finite realm of time, space, matter, energy, laws of physics. I think that the idea of a first cause is problematic, because there's so many arguments that are leveled against it. And I don't rest my entire arguments on the necessity of the plausibility of a first cause argument, right? Like, if there's a first cause, what caused that cause? As you said, the turtles all the way down. But we have this evidence of creativity, right? The emergence of the Big Bang, this first primordial emergence, which is a momentous, even sacred event, the beginning of the universe. And we can appreciate that the amount of creativity that went into that, and the amount of creativity that's been unfolding since then, and the amount of creativity that we increasingly hold in our hands as free will creatures, as humans who can construct the universe, construct our world, with greater and greater power, right? This is evidence that the purpose of the universe, the purpose of the finite, evolving universe of time and space, is for there to be a kind of a rediscovery of what's perfect, autopoietically, right, by humans. In other words, again, speaking theologically, arguing in the book, in both the Evolution's Purpose and my latest book, The Presence of the Infinite, I argue that that when we look at the structure of emergence and everything we come to know scientifically, philosophically, and spiritually about the universe's fantastic origin and its becoming, is that there is a full-blown spiritual teaching, in this story of our origins, right? That it's not just an inert scientific theory, that it teaches us about our purpose as individuals and indeed the larger purpose of humanity and the universe itself. And so these spiritual teachings of evolution, as I argue, point to the idea that if we allow for the philosophical conception of the infinite and the finite, in other words, the finite had a distinct and dramatic beginning with the Big Bang. But many have argued, from different, spiritual perspectives, East and West, that this finite universe is somehow sort of permeated by and contained within a larger infinite universe. And one way to look at it is that the finite universe is a clearing or an opening within this larger infinite universe wherein time can be expressed and consciousness can make real choices. And in this realm of the finite, this gradual complexification, this gradual emergence of consciousness, this gradual emergence of the beautiful, the true, and the good is indicating that this is the purpose of the universe, to sort of, for humans like us and free will creatures throughout the universe, to discover what's beautiful, true, and good, to make the universe gradually more perfect, as defined by making it more beautiful, more true, and more good. As we create value and we experience value, we become more evolved and the world becomes more evolved. And so this idea of value, revolution creating value, and humans being able to recognize and create value at a whole new level, that's what we're about. That's what our cosmic purpose is. And, again, as I argue, it's hard to unpack all of these subtle, nuanced arguments in an interview like this. And I can point your listeners to my books where these are, argued with greater rigor. But for purposes of this interview, just kind of giving you the conclusion of the arguments, that is that the larger purpose of the universe is for us to discover and create the beautiful, the true, and the good, and that both in this life and, again, if we're going to allow for a spiritual worldview, in the afterlife, that is that our consciousness will continue to evolve after our bodies are decayed, and that this process of perfecting the universe, perfecting self, culture, and even nature or the world we're in, that this is a process that can help us understand what we're here to do and what the universe is all about.
Well, just and I'll end this segment on asking you this question, and then we'll wrap up the interview, and I'll give you a chance to just sort of cull and condense all your thoughts on this. And like you said, we could go on for hours on this, but just to distill it down, the old argument is that no matter what number you can think of, infinity is bigger because you can just add one, and you can just add one to the one. And when you're talking about, for example, the discovery of the true, beautiful, and good, couldn't someone simply say, well, why? I mean, ultimately, you can always ask that, if that's the purpose, but then why is that the purpose? Don't you sort of get that sort of infinite regress, the way you do with infinity by just asking why? Why?
No, I think that there is the buck stops with God, if you will. Again, I'm not talking about a mythic cosmic magician. I'm not talking about the creator God of the sky as viewed by the pre-modern religions. But the idea that we, in a sense, embody the whole, at least allegorically, and in some ways literally, and we have purpose. The idea that we are the part and we have purpose, we have consciousness, we're self-aware, but the whole, the source of reality lacks self-awareness or consciousness or purpose. I think that the existence of humans themselves challenge that materialistic conclusion. So I do, in my work and in my convictions, recognize an element of self-awareness in a larger infinite universe. And I think that this idea of why, what possible, the humans pursuing the beautiful, the true, and the good, a larger cosmos directed at gradual perfection through beauty, truth, and goodness. What possible purpose does that have? And the answer to that, as I say, well, if we can posit, again, using this idea of the infinite and the finite, the infinite, from a spiritual definition, if we endow the infinite with self-awareness and non-duality, the infinite source of the universe is, in a sense, existentially perfect. And what does existential perfection, unchanging, complete perfection, what does that, do for an encore, if you will? How could perfection be made more perfect? Even though it's a tautology to even talk in these terms. And the answer is that existential perfection can be supplemented or augmented by experiential perfection achieved in time. In other words, we are experiencing becoming perfect, both in our own evolution and in the evolution of the larger culture that we're a part of, even though we only get a snapshot of it in this life. If we posit our career as universe ascenders, and we'll get a much larger slice of this larger universe project of perfecting the finite, and that we will have gone through it as we will, as experiential creatures, as participants in this perfecting project. We in a sense weave a thread from the dirt, from our physical animal existence to our eventual spiritual destiny, paradise, or however you want to frame it, nirvana. So the idea that humans add to the finite universe, the cosmic economy of evolution, adds to existential perfection the experience of gradually becoming perfect, so that the creatures of evolution are recruited to the task of completing the project of evolution in time and in experience, thereby making the universe even more perfect through the addition of this experiential dimension of perfection.
Well, let's end this segment here. In the final segment, I'll give you a few minutes to just wrap up your thoughts, and we'll do that in a moment. I have been speaking with Steve McIntosh about the nature of purpose. SteveMcIntosh.com is his website. I'll have a link below this video. Steve, if you could just take a couple of minutes, maybe just summarize your thoughts and your theses in your philosophy.
Sure. First, thanks for your attention to my work. It's been an interesting conversation. In terms of the summary of my work, my work in integral philosophy is focused on understanding and fostering the evolution of human consciousness and culture. And that work comes to the fore in the emergence of a new worldview, this integral or evolutionary worldview, which transcends the postmodern countercultural worldview. It includes its accomplishments, but transcends it. This emerging evolutionary perspective, or this integral worldview that my work represents, and that is represented by other practitioners of this integral perspective around the world, it's improving our definition of improvement itself. It's transcending the progressive culture that is in some ways the most evolved culture that's yet to appear, because it does what progressive culture can't do, and that is it reaches back to previous worldviews, modernity, traditional worldview, the pre-traditional worldviews, and it appreciates that the values of those worldviews are in a sense extremely necessary. They need to be carried forward into our current cultural circumstances. Postmodernism makes its advance as a culture by pushing off against modernity, by rejecting modernity, by saying, like, we're tired of a culture that values status and material. We're tired of a culture that pollutes the world. We're tired of a culture that creates gross inequality, right? That's a significant improvement in morality and cultural awareness, right? The progressive culture that's more inclusive and more sympathetic and compassionate and wants to make the world better in ways that modernity has screwed it up, that's an advance. But with this pattern of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, originally identified by Hegel, through which evolution proceeds, we can see it in culture in the sense that this progressive, countercultural, postmodern perspective is the antithesis to the establishment, which is the traditional and the modernist worldviews. And now we're going beyond the postmodern, if you'll pardon the phrase. It's kind of a post-postmodern perspective, which then goes from antithesis to synthesis. It's a worldview that appreciates the achievements and the sensitive and inclusive values of progressive perspectives, but it also appreciates how those progressive perspectives depend upon the accomplishments of modernity, right? Creating a wealthy and connected society, right? Without that, postmodern culture would quickly wither away. Likewise, modernity itself depends on the value accomplishments of the traditional worldview, bringing honesty, decency, fair play, right, respect for rightful authority. These traditional pre-modern values are a prerequisite achievement to creating the wealthy, connected society of modernity. So, just to conclude this sort of frame, we understand that human consciousness and culture is not just a seamless continuum or a linear progression. It's a dialectical progression by steps and stages. And there's now emerging at this time in history a new step. The next historically significant step, what we like to refer to as a kind of a second enlightenment, right? We're reclaiming this view of interiority, and we're appreciating consciousness and culture in a new light.
Well, again, SteveMcIntosh.com is Steve's website. You can check out his work there. Also, his books will be linked there as well. I want to thank you for taking about an hour or so to speak about your ideas about the nature of purpose. As you said, it's a rarely discussed topic in any forum. But again, thank you for your time and your expertise.
Thank you, Dan. It's a pleasure to be with you.